So as you noted at the top, I am going to put you in teacher mode for the first segment here. And we'll start with a specific question that stems from your piece in 2013. Who was Scott Forstall? Why is he no longer at Apple? And how is that story relevant to Apple's evolution as a company over the last 10 years?
Well, Scott Forstall is a mythic creature because he left Apple a long time ago, 2012, 2013, somewhere around then. And so because he's been gone for so long, he gets to wear all the sort of angst and wishes of people that are critical of everything Apple has done since then. And can say, oh, if only Scott Forstall was there.
He never made a mistake. This is what people do with Grantland, for the record. They talk about Grantland like it was the greatest website in the history of the world. And the further we get, the more perfect Grantland becomes. So
Grantland was the most perfect history, was the best website in the history of the world. And for the record,
was a great website.
I said that. I said 2 points. Number one, I said that when it existed. So this isn't a looking backwards thing. And number two, it employed Andrew Sharp. How could it not have been one of the greatest websites of all time?
I enjoyed my time there.
Hey, Grantland, people don't realize, Grantland, the sort of Bill Simmons project that started at ESPN, it was amazing. Like, Grantland was one of the last content-focused destination sites where every single day, I had Grantland saved on my iPhone screen. I would go there and I would read what was on there, even if it was about a subject that I didn't think I cared about, because I had such a high confidence that it would be a great article that I'd be happy to have read. And that's an amazing place to be. And ESPN killed it in budget cuts and fights with Bill Simmons, and maybe it would have never existed going forward, but it was truly one of the greatest websites of all time. But I would like to think that we are, in some small senses, sort of the progeny of Grantland. Because where did you learn to podcast, Andrew?
Out there in LA, my first podcast with Juliet Littman and Chris Ryan. And then I got a note from Bill saying, you're pretty good at podcasting. And here we are.
A classic example. You're like, podcasting is stupid. I can't believe I'm doing this.
All right. So Grantland was great and deserves the reputation. Tell me about Scott Forstall.
Scott Forstall, the Grantland of tech executives. I like it. It's even better than unicorn. Unicorn has other meanings. So yes, we'll stick with that one. I'm adding this to the Sharp Tech nomenclature going forward.
Perfect.
A mythical creature. So my personal experience with Scott Forstall, which I think helps color some of this, was one of the greatest things about being an intern at Apple, which I was in 2010 with the Apple University team, when that team was just getting spun up. Today, it's kind of more like a glorified HR organization. Back then, it was like the original vision, which is we're going to help Apple's top 200, which is like this sort of mythical group of people that get to go to the big retreat every year where they make all their plans for the future, help them understand what makes Apple Apple. There's a bit where I think that entire concept is doomed. When you start codifying things, you start to ossify them, but that's a completely separate discussion that we could have another time. But I was there, and this was all interns in the company. Every week there was a lunch where a different Apple executive would come in, and they would some of them would present, some of them would just take Q&A. So we got to talk. We got Steve Jobs, we got Johnny Ive, we got Tim Cook, we got Scott Forstall, we got a whole bunch of other executives.
It's a pretty
truly an amazing experience.
Opportunity.
No, it was awesome. So Scott I can't remember now exactly what Forstall said in that presentation, other than the fact, the tangible sense you got coming out of that presentation is this is the most arrogant son of a bitch I've ever encountered in my life.
Okay.
I can't even remember the detail. It's one of those things where memories are like tinted by emotion, right? This is the problem with you're in law school, right? You know the problem of like eyewitnesses in like crimes, right? It's like what actually happened versus where that person feel as it was happening that colors their recollection. And what I remember from that presentation is like the palpable, tangible sense of arrogance that emanated off of this guy. So when you fast forward a few years and he basically gets unceremoniously dumped from Apple, and for allegedly because of the Apple Maps failure. But really what you heard is just everyone in the executive team just hated this guy. You're like, yep, that makes sense. I can get it. What you also heard, though, sorry, go ahead.
Well, no, I was just going to ask. I mean, so what were his responsibilities? Like, why would he be conceivably the fall guy for Apple Maps 15 years ago?
Well, this gets to the other perspective that you would get from him if you talk to people from Apple at the time. I don't know if I've ever talked to employees more loyal to their boss than anyone who worked for Scott Forstall. And so who was Scott Forstall? He was like okay, we're going deep back into history. And all this is, we said at the top, psychology of Apple. This might all be BS. This is like the Apple vaporware of podcasts. Take it with a grain of salt. This is my takes on it as someone who worked at Apple for 3 months. I think that perspective was actually, I was in a very unique place to get some really interesting insights. I talked to a lot of senior executives, people very senior who were at Apple for a long time. And so I think I have some interesting insights. Obviously, I followed the company for years, but this is one person's perspective. So take it with a grain of salt. So with that caveat up front.
Okay.
You have the original Apple at 1976, I believe it was, started the company. They made Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak. Wozniak's the technical genius. Jobs is the marketing guy, the idea guy, the sort of conniving one who already ripped off Steve Wozniak at Atari. All the a whole package is, I think, one way to put it. They start Apple. Their first computer is the Apple I, which is basically just a motherboard. You had to provide everything else around it. Then the Apple II, huge breakout. It was actually a whole computer. You could do, like, the first version, this first spreadsheet was written for the Apple II. It was a big deal. It carried the company actually for a very long time. You fast forward, they make something called the Lisa, which is the first graphical user interface, way too expensive, kind of a failure. Then the Macintosh in 1984. And people think about the Macintosh as being the core of Apple, but actually throughout the 80s was the Apple II. That's what actually paid the bills. Steve Jobs didn't care about the Apple II. That was old technology. He cared about the Mac, was spending tons of money. It was losing tons of money, and Steve Jobs gets fired. He wasn't focused on the actual core business. He was off here just, being a pain in the rear end. And so Apple, the Macintosh, though, ends up becoming a hit over time as it gets more capable. It gets a huge market in desktop publishing because you get WYSIWYG. What you see is what you get. You could actually design newspapers and whatever on it. So Apple's doing pretty well through the 80s and 90s. In the 90s, they really start to fall behind. Macintosh OS, Classic OS, is technically, it has so much technical debt. It was still downstream from the original Macintosh operating system. If one application crashed, your whole computer would crash. It wasn't memory safe. It was just a total mess. And their hardware is falling behind. The Wintel sort of duopoly is running circles around them. Windows was a technically superior operating system, and Intel chips were way faster. It was just better in every respect. It's still, the Macintosh still had that ineffable taste. Like, people liked using it. I remember when I worked for the student newspaper in college, I gravitated towards the Macs. I just liked using them. And plus I, learned how to use Quark Express and lay stuff out. But it from any technical perspective, they stunk. And the company is flailing around trying to find the next thing. This is where the vaporware in total absence of credibility comes from. And they're demoing all these things, doing XYZ. They're on the edge of bankruptcy. There's this famous Wired cover of Apple, the multicolored Apple logo with like a crown of thorns or a wreath of thorns around it. And it just says pray. It's one of the best magazine covers of all time. It's so good. And
they had lost like $1 billion at that point.
They had lost, which back then was a lot of money.
A lot. Good point. Back in 1995.
This is back when you could talk about tech and also have some understanding of the normal economy.
Yep.
A skill that I have lost. So they're in trouble. They reverse acquire a company called Next, which Steve Jobs had started, and Next basically takes over Apple. The reason why this is important is Scott Forstall was a Next guy. He never worked at the original Apple, and he was hired, I think, as an intern with Next. He came up through that, and one of the challenges that faced Steve Jobs when he came back to Apple was basically merging Next, which made their own computers. It was an Apple sort of thing, but they were more focused on the high end. They got a decent market in education, particularly I think like universities and things like that, but still mostly a failed company with Apple. And you wanted to combine sort of the Apple sensibility and design and obviously the user base with the Next underpinnings, which Next, by virtue of being developed later than the Macintosh, was much more sort of technically forward. It was memory safe. It was built on Unix as its underpinning. So it was like this ended up being a huge deal later for why developers adopted the Mac. You could have the same environment that you would have on a server, sort of on your local computer. This is before things like containers and stuff like that. But there was this real challenge to merge the stuff together. And there was an executive, I think Bernard Sorlet, I believe was his name, that was sort of the head of this. And Forstall was sort of under him as his deputy. Again, this young guy who'd come up through Next and is coming in Apple. And I don't know, but I suspect this is where a lot of the anti-Forstall sentiment started. You had a lot of the Apple people that did not like guy? This. Yeah, sure. This guy coming in and sort of telling them what to do. But Jobs appreciated Forstall, I think, a lot. Like, when you think about it, you're the guy at top.
This was the DNA that would ultimately define the new era of Apple, correct?
That's right.
Like from an OS standpoint.
The DNA is Next. And you go, actually, if you program for even an iOS, there's some functions you call that are NS, The NS is Next Step. Like, there's still stuff in here that is from back then. And so it's funny. Someone asked me on Twitter, like, what's the oldest code in iOS? And they went back to like the 2000s. I'm like, no, like there's Unix code in here. There's code that goes back to the 70s. That is it. And that's the case for all your software products. You'd be shocked and dismayed to understand the underpinnings of
everything is held up on scaffolding that was established in like the 1970s.
That's right.
Yeah.
But there's lots of Next stuff. But yes, that was the core of Apple software going forward. And that core, that kernel, is undergirds Mac OS today. It undergirds iOS, tvOS, everything else. It's all in this common foundation that is from Next. And to the extent that the Apple bit came in, it was more on top of making an aesthetic that you the top menu bar and stuff like that. Like that was familiar. And when the first OS 10 came out, a lot of it was written OS X, but it's pronounced OS 10. A lot of Apple people like lost their minds. It's like, what are you doing here? This is terrible. But it was obviously, in retrospect, the right thing to do. So you fast forward, and Steve Jobs, I think, did a very good job of being the decider in chief, or the editor in chief is the way I always characterize it. He had different people that were fighting each other and going back and forth, and he would choose the way. He wasn't designing it, he was deciding it. And that, I think, is very underrated and underappreciated, how important that was. And that is Steve Jobs is the one that made this merger of Next Step superior technical underpinnings with the Apple aesthetic and design. He made that merger work. That merger does not happen without Steve Jobs as a force of nature making it happen and making the decisions to push things forward and mollifying one group and
managing the factions. Of course,
that's right.
That makes sense.
So you fast forward, and Apple's going to do this new project that turned out to be the iPhone, and that the person that was put in charge of that from a software perspective was Scott Forstall. So he basically, iOS is Scott Forstall's baby. And just like the hardware in the phone was, or the technical underpinnings was Tony Fadell, who had done the iPod, and then you had Johnny Ive doing the design, and you have like there's obviously other people involved. There's a guy called Bob Mansfield that features in here, but Bob Mansfield, I should say. So anyhow, the biggest project ever, right? It turns out to be the best product ever. And it's obviously a amazing success. It's a technological success. It's a software success. It's a design success. The entire industry copies it. It's software defined hardware where Apple exclusively sells the hardware, and the software provides the ecosystem and the lock-in and all these sorts of things. And a total triumph. Scott Forstall led this team in the dark, total secrecy, and they delivered. And within the first year, there becomes this big question. developers really want to build apps for this. They really want to build apps for this phone. We already have obviously all the APIs because we had to build our own apps internally. And Steve Jobs like, nope, no apps. And he gets on the website. We got a great solution for you. Web apps. You can save it on your home screen. And everyone, I think with the term, I don't remember who coined it. This was the shit sandwich. I'm probably Gruber, to be honest. And then then people start like jailbreaking their phone and figuring out how to run apps anyway. And they're like backwards engineering and like figuring out all the various function calls and things like that to do this. And the big advocate in Apple to allow apps was Scott Forstall. He was the guy that was, of all the Apple executives, was the most pro developer. And I think this is pretty undisputed. Whereas a lot of the Apple core was more suspicious of developers, and this is the key point, which we'll get to in a moment. So that's
okay.
So some foreshadowing. But he was the big developer advocate, and if you talk to developers back then, particularly senior ones at large companies, they or bespoke companies that made amazing things, they would have an audience with Forstall and felt that he was an advocate for them. And the fact that the App Store existed as it did and the features that existed for developers and the work Apple did, I think pretty universally most people ascribe to Forstall.
Downstream of Forstall. So then where was the power struggle where Maps becomes a pretext to force him out? What was the tension?
Steve Jobs died. I think that's the real issue. Steve Jobs had cultivated these warring fiefdoms that over time, after a decade of working together, just hated each other, just absolutely despised each other. But guess what? If Steve Jobs calls a meeting and Scott Forstall is going to be there and you're Johnny Ive or Bob Mansfield, you go to the meeting because Steve Jobs called a meeting and you're going to fight and you're going to hate that guy, but Steve will figure it out. And you can go to Steve afterwards, say, I'm sick of this. And he's going to say, deal with it, or, whatever it might be.
But yeah,
you see this. Here's a good analogy for you. Red Bull Racing, right? What has happened to Red Bull in the last 2 years? You had basically two major factions. You had the Christian Horner faction, and maybe Newey was his own faction, I'm not sure. But then you also had the Helmut Marko faction. And as long as the founder of Red Bull was alive, Dieter Maschwitz, I believe that is his name.
Yep.
It worked. What happened the moment he died?
Open war.
And I think I think it's actually a perfect analogy of what happened in Apple. You have Tim Cook come in as the CEO, very low credibility in terms of the actual software. He's the operations guy, right? He can run the company, but that credibility wasn't just internal to Apple, it was also with Wall Street. Wall Street was very nervous when Steve Jobs died. And one of the ways that Apple addressed that was putting Johnny Ive front and center. Don't worry, Steve's gone, but Johnny's still here.
Here's this creative genius that you guys can trust to.
Yeah, who designed all this stuff, right? And that was the stories. He designed the iPhone, even though I think iOS is more important to the success of the iPhone than the design of the iPhone. Scott Forstall deserves more credit than Johnny Ive does, in my opinion, for the iPhone in particular. The iPod, different story. That is the Johnny Ive crowning achievement. But I would argue it's different when it comes to the iPhone. But Wall Street doesn't have that distinction. And it was actually really, for Apple, they felt it was very important to have Johnny Ive put a foot forward.
Okay.
I think this was a disaster for Apple. I think Johnny Ive, without a boss, was terrible. We got the MacBooks with keyboards that didn't work, too few ports. Like Steve Jobs would talk about function over form. Apple products became form over function. You got the iPhone 6 that bent. You got $17,000 gold Apple Watches. Just Johnny Ive's brilliant, but he needs an editor. Steve Jobs was that editor. And I just think it was a very bad decade for Apple. But what was worse is, and this is all scuttlebutt, just what I've heard, it basically got to the point where Johnny Ive would not attend a meeting if Scott Forstall was there. It was a him or me situation. And as I believe Bob Vance, I mentioned him before, I believe he was in the same boat. He was more on the hardware side, but he similarly, and again, I've had one interaction with Scott Forstall and just as the audience, and I completely believe all the stories based on that one story. Okay, so you have
But
this.
also, you talk about the sort of rudderless decade with Johnny Ive without a editor. That same decade was when developer relations began to sour, and there was no advocate for the developers in that sort of power
Right. It's
struggle.
exactly. Which I think that's why we're getting to this whole story. So Apple Maps launches, it's a disaster. Apparently the official story is a demand that Scott Forstall personally take responsibility for it publicly, which, by the way, Apple doesn't do. That's like, you see that this week with Apple Intelligence. If anyone takes personal responsibility, it's the CEO.
Sword. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's the CEO. That's the whole structure of Apple. Being a functional organization, the CEO is the head. Apple is to use another F1 analogy, it is a Red Bull car that's super pointy on the front end that no normal driver can handle, but Max Verstappen can. And that driver was Steve Jobs. And part of the process when he was gone was reshaping an organization that couldn't stick together without him. And because of that, I think you can make a strong argument that Forstall getting fired was the right thing to do, because the priority then was to keep the company together in a very uncertain period when it was a company that was tuned to run around Steve Jobs, and Steve Jobs wasn't there. They had to figure out a way to keep going. The problem is that Apple lost its biggest internal developer advocate. The guy that actually stood up for Apple stood up against Apple, like the Apple within Apple, and said, no, actually developers matter. We have to do things for them. We have to think about them. And I do think this is where all the developer stuff really started to go off the rails. There's just no one in Apple who is truly a developer advocate at the senior levels, as far as we can tell. Again, just knowing the executives who've been around for a long time. And when you look at the actions, like, they just don't do stuff that's friendly to developers. They do stuff that's friendly to Apple, and you have to take it or leave it. And it was okay because the iPhone was so dominant. They could get away with treating developers like crap, and developers would still build apps for Apple. They would dig the moat for the iPhone because the market was so large, they had no other choice.